Good evening. I'm Trey Johnson, coming to you live from the Kansas Museum of History. Thank you all for joining us for our monthly virtual Museum After Hours program. As always, tonight's program will be followed by a question and answer period with our presenter. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen or the chat feature to post your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Tai Edwards, Professor of History at Johnson County Community College in Overland Park, Kansas. Edwards' research and teaching focuses on U.S. history, colonization, indigenous peoples, gender, and disease. She is also the Kansas Studies Institute Director at JCCC, where she has worked on a myriad of projects, including veterans' oral histories, preserving the Quindaro townsite ruins in Kansas City, Kansas, and much more. The focus of tonight's presentation will be on Osage Women and Empire, Gender and Power. Most histories claim the Osage Empire was built by Osage men's prowess at hunting and war, but Osage cosmology defined men and women as necessary pairs. In their society, hunting and war, like everything else, involved both men and women. Only by studying the gender roles of both can we hope to understand the rise and fall of the Osage Empire. Dr. Tai Edwards brings gender construction to the fore in the context of Osage history through the 19th century. Through the lens of gender, and by drawing on the insights of archaeology, ethnography, linguistics, and oral history, Osage Women and Empire presents a new, more nuanced picture of the critical role of men and women in the period when the Osage rose to power in the western Mississippi Valley, and when that power later declined on their Kansas reservation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tai Edwards.
Thank you, Trey. That was a wonderful introduction. I appreciate that. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I want to thank the Kansas Historical Society for hosting this event. If you look through the footnotes of my book, you will find lots of Kansas Historical Society materials, and their archives were important to my research and my work. And I also want to thank you for joining me for this virtual event. I know some of you might wish that we could meet in person like this speaker series used to be and usually was. But I will say it is sometimes fun to have these different formats because it can bring in people that might not have otherwise been able to join us. So I'm hopeful that this can be something that we can all enjoy together. All right, so I'm going to share some slides. So this is always a fun moment in a Zoom meeting when the slides get shared. So I have some slides here to help kind of guide us through what we're going to talk about. All right, so let's start with where we are. So I know some of you online might not be where we are, where I am, but I am in Kansas. And of course, this is a state that used to be the homeland of the Kansa people, and that is who our state is named after. I work at Johnson County Community College, as Trey told you, and Johnson County Community College is named for Thomas Johnson, who was a missionary and an enslaver who moved to what we now call Kansas to missionize the Shawnee people who were forced to move to what we call Kansas as part of colonization. We know that these places have these names, right? We've heard of Johnson. Of course, we've heard of Kansas. If you've been in Johnson County, of course, there's Shawnee Mission. Many things are named for the Shawnee and Shawnee people. And we do a better job of remembering those names and those terms than we do the things that tie them together. And the things that tie them together is colonialism. And colonialism is what I'm interested in. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm also a member of the Academy, and I'm a scholar. And the Academy and scholars have also been agents of colonialism. We have replicated and justified colonial hierarchies in our work and our workplaces over decades. And of course, my intention is to not do those things and to resist those efforts in my work. But to be realistic, I probably have not discarded all of the baggage that white Americans carry. And I think we need to be conscious about that when we're talking about these subjects. One of the things that was important to my work is to use the scholarship of people that are of the community that I'm talking about. So a lot of times people wrongly assume that indigenous people do not write their own history, and that's not the case. And it's certainly not the case with the Osage. And there are many Osage scholars who have written their history. And so here's a list of some of the scholars who are littered throughout my work and whose work I highly recommend and you should read, who have produced all kinds of great scholarship about the Osage. But what we're talking about today is the 18th and the 19th century. And I want to go back here to this first slide. So you can see this image. This is the cover of the book. And this is a Catlin painting of Wachite from the 1830s. And this, you may have seen some of the Catlin images. His paintings are very famous. And he has some very famous paintings of Osage men. And those have been on the covers of various books in recent decades and recent years. But I couldn't find a book that Wachite was on the cover of. And this painting of her really embodies a lot of the things that are in my book. And I think it's really important that she's holding a child. That's an important part of women's work. And her clothes are something that would have been a product of women's labor. And then, as it says there in the caption, her parting of her hair is painted red, which was part of the Osage daily prayer ritual that they conducted at multiple points during the day. And you can see that here. Okay, so first let's start off with gender. So my work is about gender. So gender is a construction. So what we mean by that is every society constructs gender, how many genders there are, power relations between those genders, and appropriate behaviors for those genders for themselves. Okay, so every society constructs gender for itself, how many there are, power relations between, and acceptable behaviors for each. And so I'm interested in how the Osage constructed gender and how that informed their actions and their behaviors. So let me read you a little bit from the book to set us up for this. And I should warn you, so English also presents colonial problems. So I'm going to use words like priesthood and marriage, which are terms in English that mean very specific things that I'm implying are equivalents in the Osage case, and they are sort of equivalents, but not perfect equivalents. So keep that in your mind in terms of language. The Osage priesthood organized Osage life based on the dual masculine and feminine forces they observed in celestial and seasonal cycles. Rituals required both male and female participation and defined a sexual division of labor without hierarchical difference. Spiritually, two things were necessary for continued national existence. One, women creating, and two, men protecting and providing. This meant women created future citizens, food, trade goods, and all the domestic items. Men killed game animals and enemies in warfare. Therefore, men and women worked together to guarantee the nation's future. Because of their different roles, each gender achieved status and power in distinct ways. Women were born with it, and men had to earn it. But life was not as strictly divided as one might think. In order for hunting to produce anything, men had to kill and women had to process. Warfare required male valor, but women ritually combined their courage with men's, and both were credited in victories. Men held political leadership positions as chiefs, but their authority was subordinate to the priesthood, which incorporated women in a variety of ways. In other words, men and women collaborated in virtually everything, and very little could be strictly divided into separate spheres. So that sort of sets you up with how the Osage construction functioned. So the Osage, like many indigenous North Americans, had a gender system that we call gender complementarity. Okay, so gender complementarity. And this complementary nature of the genders was embedded in their spirituality and their ritual. So I mentioned daily prayers, there's also hunting and war preparation, corn planting, and a variety of ceremonial practices. Okay, so women and men. So women were the channel through whom all human life must proceed and continue. And women were considered mystic in the sense that they had the sacred power of creating human life, right? Much like the great mysterious Wakanda created human life. Women could do that too, right, by reproducing humans. So because that was the spiritual nature of women's power, their work then was connected to that. So work was reproductive, creative, and life-giving. So women were bearing and rearing children. They raised crops, which were considered similar to children, right, taking seeds, nurturing them, and they grow to maturity, gathering plant foods, processing meat and hides, constructing lodges, and then manufacturing all of the clothing and utensils used in their homes. Okay, so men. Men. All right, so the life granted by Wakanda must be protected. The woman, the children she bears, the home she builds for their shelter and comfort, the fields she cultivates must be guarded. The land upon which the tribe depends for plant and animal food must be held against invasion, and the life of the individual and the tribe itself must at all times be defended from enemies. So you can see, I love the way that reads, right? The woman, the children she bears, the home she builds, right? The way it's centering women's creativity as what men are protecting. All right, so then what work did men do as part of this role? They were engaged in providing, protecting, and life-taking, which was considered, right, the opposite of women's work. So hunting, diplomatic and war expeditions, and then manufacturing all the tools necessary for their work. So this is how the gender complementarity worked, right? So you sort of had this dual nature of the universe, of seasonal cycles, and of Osage life. And I always think of it as sort of like the globe, right? Like if you think about planet Earth, right? It's polarized and it's circular, and that's what it looks like. Okay, but that implies that there's a significant amount of separation, right? Which may or may not actually be true. So it's not entirely separate spheres, is what I'm saying here. So spirituality and the economy embodied gender complementarity, but things weren't as separate as you might think. So one great example of that I talk about in the book is alternative genders. So you may know that many indigenous North American societies had what we called a multi-gender paradigm, which means they believed there were more genders than just male and female, and that this was structured into society, this was structured into spiritual practice, and accepted. All right, and again, back to that circle of the globe, again, it's the way I say it is it's polarized, right? So you might have male and female as the polarized version, but there's all of this space in between, right, where people could exist in a variety of contexts. So that was the case with the Osage as well. All right, so cooking, that might seem like women's sphere, but women prepared meals, but when women were too busy, especially during and after hunts, men cooked. And of course, when men were gone on war and hunting expeditions, they didn't just starve, they also fed themselves. All right, so agriculture, that was also women's work, right? It's a creative work, much like child rearing. So women farmed, owned the fields and their produce, but men, under women's direction, could clear fields. So they were allowed to do some work in the fields, but women had to be in charge of it. So hunting, men did the physical killing, but women turned carcasses into food and trade items. This is one of the big things, is I'd love to convince many of my colleagues that we shouldn't think of hunting as exclusively male, because nothing comes from the hunt if women don't process the hides. War. So men physically fought in warfare, but in the Osage society, women ritually combined their courage with men's, and both were credited in victories. And this was part of spiritual practices after battle. Diplomacy, men held political leadership as chiefs, but women contributed through hospitality and feast preparation. And then, of course, the priesthood, right, the spiritual elite, they were preeminent in all matters. In order for a man to become a priest, he had to be married, and he and his wife were initiated together. But women could remain part of the priesthood without men if their husbands passed away, so they could fulfill their husband's role. And women likely served as independent members in the priesthood in some ways. Okay, so my overall argument in my book is that gender is deeply embedded in the Osage worldview and spirituality. It animated their lives and experiences, and therefore survival and success required both men and women. That was their perception of the world. So women and men cooperated to build an Osage empire in the 18th century, and women and men cooperated in resisting U.S. colonization thereafter. Gender was also a central site in experiencing and resisting colonialism. And I can't say this last point enough. The toll, though, of colonialism will be brutal. And we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. So as long as the Osage spirituality and their agriculture, hunting, and trade economy remained intact, so these predated European colonization, and as long as their spirituality, their agriculture, hunting, and trading economy remained intact, then their gender roles remain intact. All right, so these things are all tied up with one another. And I argue that this lasts until the late 19th century, which is a period of continuity, even though it is a period, especially as we get later into the 19th century, of extreme stress. Okay, so there is change in some things, but overarchingly in spirituality and economy, there is continuity. Okay, so you heard briefly there in Trey's introduction about an Osage Empire, and I put empire, of course, in my title. So as you may know, there are several indigenous nations that scholars call indigenous empires in the era after European colonization began. So there are various examples. So the Comanche are a good example in the West. The Siouan people are a good example on the Northern Plains. The Osage are an example on the Southern Plains. And there are other examples too, but these are some of the big ones that are close to our region. And these are indigenous people whose power and economic prowess and wealth expanded in the colonial period, especially the early colonial period, as they incorporated colonization and colonizers into their national experience in ways that benefited them. Now, I should qualify my terms a little bit here. So when we talk about an Osage Empire, the big difference you'll see, and Osage scholars like Lewis Burns talk about this, the difference between an Osage Empire and, let's say, a British Empire is that the Osage definitely controlled territory. They certainly had conflict and warfare with their indigenous rivals, but cultural sovereignty was never under attack. So we're going to talk in a second about efforts to change indigenous people by Americans into culturally different people. You will not see that, right? So cultural sovereignty was never under attack for any Osage rivals or for any of the people living near them. That's not something you see happening in their expansion of power. Okay, so there's a long history of an Osage Empire. So here you see maps. So this is the Osage homeland from the 1720s to the 1800s, and you can see the dark circle that's smaller is sort of the area that the Osage lived in, homeland, area of control. And then you can see that much larger circle is the expansive area that they came to control in this period. Okay, so how did this happen? All right, so let me read you a little bit from the book again. Once the French built trading posts along the periphery of Osage territory in the 1720s, the Osage became middlemen in the exchanges between the French and more Western and Southern indigenous communities. French traders attempted to initiate trade relations with Western and Southern native groups. However, the Osage prevented, violently if necessary, any threats, both native and European, to their position as middlemen. Taking advantage of their large population, estimates range from 10 to 18,000, and resource-rich location between the Mississippi River and the Prairie Plains, the Osage became the primary economic and military power in Western Louisiana. As historian Kathleen Duval put it, the Osage proved far more successful than either France or Spain at building a mid-continental empire. And I think that's a fair assessment. So the Osage were able to take their population, and they would have viewed their large population as a product of women's power, right? The bearing of children, and deploy that population to control the access to European trade goods, all right? So French traders had to go through the Osage to trade those goods out to other indigenous people. So other indigenous people that didn't have direct access to the French would have to rely on Osage traders to get access to goods. And so that's what expands Osage power. All right, so in building power, this is a trade relationship. And so the Osage traded in three main things. So the first thing were deer skins. That was their most prolific trade item. And I really can't say how much the volume of trading was impressive and grew in this period. So let me read you a little bit about this. By the late 1700s, Osage men likely doubled or tripled the amount of time they spent hunting. Hunters procured enough hides and meat to occupy multiple women for days or weeks at a time. An Osage man's hunting prowess mattered little, though, without female labor, because traders demanded expertly tanned hides that would survive the trip back to Europe. Indigenous women in the hide trade generally, and among the Osage specifically, monopolized the skills needed to produce these finished goods, placing a high value on their labor. From the Osage perspective, hunting had always been a collaborative effort, but in the 18th and early 19th century, this cooperation led to imperial domination. Osage men and women produced hides on a staggering scale. Prices varied based on animal size of the skin, quality of the processing, and European market rates. One historian called the Osage the true bankers of this region, since they produced the largest quantity of the best quality deer leather, and their bucks served as the main currency in Upper Louisiana. Typically, 20 medium-sized hides could buy a musket, and one medium hide could buy a horn full of powder or 2 pounds of bullets. A dressed deerskin typically weighed 1 to 2 pounds, depending on the size of the animal. Packs or bales of these skins weighed approximately 100 pounds. From 1764 to 1803, the Osage produced more than half of the hides in Spanish Illinois, amounting to roughly 600 packs of skins per year, or over 20,000 packs in total. As a result, they became the best armed Indians on the Central Prairies, furthering their military and hide trade dominance. U.S. officials calculated the illegal Osage trade at the Arkansas post for just the final 4 years of Spanish rule involved tens of thousands of skins valued at $20,000 or nearly $400,000 today. During that same period, the Little and Great Osage produced $43,000 worth of furs, over $800,000 today, showing the enormous volume of their hunting and hide processing. And that's just the ones we have good documentation for, of course. So they are hunting and hide processing on an enormous scale. They also traded horses. So the Osage acquired horses through trade with other indigenous groups. You may know after the Spanish lost control of their New Mexico colony after the Pueblo Revolt, a lot of indigenous people start to acquire Spanish horses and trade with their relationships with other indigenous trading partners. And the Osage, so for any indigenous nation, adopting livestock is a fraught choice, because if you adopt livestock, which gender is going to be the ones in charge of caring for it? Because this is going to fundamentally change dynamics between genders, workload, food provision, all kinds of things will change. So the Osage acquisition of horses is interesting because they did not breed the horses themselves. So they would hunt wild horses once those were available, and they more often raided or traded for horses. So they acquired them through these other means, so that did not require a reorganization of gender roles. And it was typically young boys who were in charge of caring for the herds as they moved them about and moved them for trade. And then the third thing that the Osage exchanged were slaves or captives taken from other indigenous communities. This was common. You may know about the Comanche Empire does similar things. And captives had long been taken in indigenous warfare prior to colonization. And captives were often traded to other indigenous groups to end conflict, or they were adopted into the indigenous nation to replace lost population because of war or disease, etc. And however, once the French show up, the French want to use captives for other purposes. They want to use captives as enslaved, chattel slaves in their homes, or send them to French Caribbean colonies. So the exchange of captives existed as a normal part of indigenous life, but the destination of those enslaved people and being long-term chattel enslaved was a change. And there's lots of great sources you can read about if you're interested in that. Okay, so as the Osage built this trading empire, expanded their geographic area of control, how did this impact society? So society had to make some changes. So one of the things that you see happening is a decentralization of the nation. So you can see there the Little Osage, the Great Osage, and the Arkansas Osage, you see moving out into new towns or separating into different towns, and a decentralization in that way. Also, scholars believe that before colonization, that the Osage were patrilocal, which means that upon partnership or marriage, a woman would move into a man's household with his extended family. But we know that in the period of the rise of the Osage Empire, the Osage transitioned to matrilocal residence. So the reason why we think this was the case is that men from the same clan formed hunting and raiding parties. And so these men could be gone for extended periods of time. And they also were, of course, doing dangerous work in hunting and warfare. So a household could be without all of their male protection and provision for extended periods while men were gone if it was patrilocal residence. But if you switch to matrilocal residence, then the women in that household are married to men from different clans, and so that household was never without male provision and protection for extended periods. This also relates to plural marriages. So we see expansion of polygyny, where we have one man with multiple spouses. And this was also aided by matrilocal residence, because women were now living with members of their extended family. And so a man, typically, if he had multiple spouses, they were sisters or cousins or women in the same extended family. And so those women would already be living together, and this would be somewhat more efficient. Now, I should say, a lot of times people have stereotypes about plural marriage and what that means based on U.S. culture and U.S. gender construction. But in Osage society, women had full control of their sexuality, and sexuality was not tied to marriage. Those things did not exist for the same purpose. And divorce was easily initiated by either partner, and you retained all of your own goods, the products of your hunt or your agriculture. And so these things were not tied together, which is one of the reasons why I felt like maybe even using the word marriage was fraught, because Americans have, and English has a lot of baggage around the word marriage. And maybe that's not exactly the correct term here, right? Household or lineage creation, which isn't the same as sexual relationships. So a lot of times people also assume that when indigenous nations build these great trading empires or have really profitable trading relationships, that it's a product of intermarriage between indigenous women and European men. In the Osage case, the Osage women did not intermarry with French trading men until after the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, which ends in 1763, and the French colonial control, at least officially, ends, even though a lot of French people remain. But French control officially ends, and the Spanish then retained control of the colony. It's in that context that prominent Osage women start marrying French traders. And you may know about the Choteaus, the founders of St. Louis. They found St. Louis intentionally as an avenue to trading relationships with the Osage. And Osage power built St. Louis wealth for the Choteau family. So this is some of the changes you see happening in their society, but overwhelmingly, society is not changing. So let me read you a brief quote here that shows you where things are at. Now, I should say there's some quotes in here from a person of the time, so you're going to hear some offensive and somewhat racist references. So those are from the original primary source. In August 1811, Fort Osage factor George C. Sibley observed over 1,000 people in an Osage hunting camp, in the full and free indulgence of all the luxuries of their rude condition. He noted an absence of illness and an abundance of supplies, including buffalo, elk, deer, marrow bones, tongues, hominy, beans, dried pumpkin, plums, and other dainties. Men's hunting and women's meat production, cultivation, and gathering produced this bounty. Vigilant elder warriors maintained camp security, while elder women were busily employed jerking and curing on scaffolds the flesh of the fat buffalo. Young men and women, adorned in the highest style of fashion, mingled in small groups. Older boys tended the horses, many girls aided their mothers, and swarms of children swam in the creek or frolicked on the prairie. Sibley concluded, "Mirth and hearty merriment prevailed. Never had I witnessed such general happiness in any community as prevailed here." These observations demonstrate how, even after a century of colonization, in many ways, Osage life continued to follow a familiar and clearly flourishing cycle. Not surprisingly, some aspects of their society changed to facilitate this. Nevertheless, gender complementarity remained a central aspect in both material and ritual life as men and women cooperated to build an Osage empire. I always love that, general happiness. All right, so this is the early part of colonization. All right, so what's going to change? So the next thing I'm going to be talking about is this early part of the 19th century. All right, so if you look at this map, one of the things you're going to notice, I'll talk about in a second, is you look at the indigenous nations there that are on the eastern boundary. So you see Sac and Fox, Kickapoo, Delaware, Shawnee, and then down on the southeast side, you see the Cherokee. Okay, this is going to be important to something I'm going to discuss here on this next slide. Okay, so the American Revolution founded, of course, the United States. It was extremely disruptive to indigenous people. And the United States and its residents, its citizens, became extremely aggressive during and after that war in encroaching and invading indigenous land and seeking indigenous land for themselves. So you see a lot of indigenous people who we might call refugees moving away from United States cities and towns and communities, and they're moving into areas where the Osage live. All right, well, the trouble is the Osage already live there, right? So this is going to increase competition for natural resources, for hunting, for trade. This is going to put more stress on people and more stress on the environment. Okay, so the Louisiana Purchase. So the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark voyage really are wrapped up in a lot of myths in American life. The Lewis and Clark voyage was intentionally designed by President Thomas Jefferson to establish colonial control of the land and the indigenous people that live there. He intentionally organized the trip in that way, and Lewis and Clark were sent to make hospitable relations with the indigenous people there because Jefferson's goal was to remove indigenous people from eastern part of North America into the Louisiana Purchase. So, of course, the most powerful indigenous people Lewis and Clark first meet, and they know this before they get there, are the Osage. So Lewis and Clark were instructed to send leaders of the powerful nations they met back to Washington to meet Jefferson. And a trip to Washington was almost always about intimidation. So they wanted to show indigenous people the military, the highly populous cities, U.S. wealth, and the whole goal was to intimidate them. So the Osage were the first people that Lewis and Clark sent to Washington to meet Jefferson in 1804. And that was intentional because Jefferson has a plan. And his plan is directly related to U.S. settler colonialism. Okay, so there are different kinds of empires and there are different kinds of colonization. So the British Empire in North America and then the United States after its independence are both what we call settler empires. Okay, so settler empires or settler colonizers, and they create settler colonies. Okay, so a settler colony intends to eliminate indigenous people so that the empire's settlers can possess their land. Okay, so a settler empire intends to eliminate indigenous people so the empire's settlers can possess their land. This is the goal. Okay, so that is what British settlers were doing in the original colonies, and that is what American settlers will be doing in the early United States. And how do you eliminate indigenous people? Okay, there are a couple of ways. All right, so one is literally eliminate people, and that's genocide. Another way is to forcibly remove people, but that's ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing, though, also kills, right? So there's the old adage, indigenous people are where they are, right? All an indigenous person had to do to get in the way of settler colonialism was stay home, as Patrick Wolf often says in his scholarship. All right, so displacement and ethnic cleansing also kills people. And then the third major way we'll see today is missionarization and assimilation programs, right? So those are efforts to culturally eliminate indigenous people and culturally eliminate them. All right, so how did Jefferson fit into this? So let me read you a little bit about Jefferson. Elimination of natives in the heart of the continent accelerated during Thomas Jefferson's presidency. Jefferson spent much of his professional life employing the doctrine of discovery to dispossess indigenous people. And after 1776, this was part of his effort to build a continental U.S. empire. Legal scholar and Shawnee Nation member Robert Miller described Jefferson as one of the most aggressive and strategically expansionist presidents who ever held the office. This was on full display with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Though scholars have often called this the greatest real estate deal in history. In reality, Jefferson was fully aware that the United States had actually purchased discovery claims and preemption rights, sole right to buy the land from natives. Based on this centuries-old European legal tradition, the United States allegedly held ultimate dominion over this land, entailing political and commercial control. While native nations retained a temporary right of occupancy until they chose to sell their land to the only legal buyer, the United States of America. Though George Washington proposed it in the 1780s and Andrew Jackson infamously championed it in the 1830s, Thomas Jefferson was actually the first president to formulate an official federal policy of removal, the first to set it in motion, the first to start removing tribes west of the Mississippi. His intention for the Louisiana Purchase was to expand upon the native migration already in progress by formally relocating all Eastern Native nations into the new territory. Though American historians have antiseptically labeled this the removal period, many historians have argued this was more accurately the era of ethnic cleansing. In a settler empire, these removed peoples actually served as proxy invaders, warring with locals like the Osage, eventually decimating all. After Eastern land was filled with American settlers, Jefferson expected the United States to establish additional states in the Louisiana Territory. Evidently, the plan was to eliminate all natives in the entirety of the U.S. All right, so, and that happens rapidly. Okay, so the Osage visited Jefferson in 1804-08. Jefferson hasn't even left office yet when American settlements are already west of St. Louis. So this is classic settler colonialism. Settlers themselves will invade indigenous land because they want to get access to the wealth that that land produces. And you see this most aggressive in the Treaty of 1808. So this is, Jefferson is still president when this happens. Okay, the Treaty of 1808 was a classic example of treaty coercion. As Jefferson had instructed, Clark abruptly demanded land cessions when Osage leaders thought they were meeting to discuss other matters. In this case, invasion by and retaliation against American settlers. Negotiations were only conducted with a few great and little Osage leaders who did not have the authority to make land cessions, and the entire nation, Arkansas bands included, was expected to abide by the treaty's provisions. And finally, Clark flatly lied about what was in the treaty. He allegedly admitted to a friend that, quote, it was the hardest bargain against the Indians he ever made, and that if he was to be damned hereafter, it would be for making that treaty. The Osage leaders were led to believe that they had agreed to share some territory with Euro-American hunters in exchange for land payments, goods, blacksmith services, plows, a grain mill, a new trading factory, Fort Osage, and federal military protection against rival natives. However, Clark, Lewis, and Jefferson claimed the Osage had ceded their title to an extent of country nearly equal to the state of Virginia and much more fertile, on which refugee natives and Americans would settle. Osage leaders were already voicing their displeasure to Lewis about this fraudulent acquisition of 52 million acres before he had even mailed the treaty to the president. But it was to no avail. Osage historian Lewis Burns concluded, considering that all forms of compensation for those lands total less than 1/6 of a cent per acre, it is reasonable to suspect that someone was cheated. Osage complaints were irrelevant because Jefferson had already set in motion a plan that by 1810 had settled over 1,000 Cherokee on Osage land. By 1820, the local Cherokee population reached at least 5,000. Of all the eastern natives moving into the region, the large, well-armed Cherokee population posed the most serious threat to date to Osage access to game and trade, and the trade wealth it produced. The Cherokees also created alliances with Osage rivals who cooperated to steal Osage horses, attacked hunting parties and communities, raided food storage caches, and burned agricultural fields. Though William Clark had promised federal protection for the Osage in the Treaty of 1808, it was not forthcoming. While natives killed each other, U.S. military protection was reserved for the tens of thousands of American settlers colonizing the region. As Jefferson had intended, Indian policy ultimately functioned to facilitate American settlers' access to land continent-wide. Hence Clark, now serving as territorial governor of Missouri, Secretary of War John C. Calhoun, and the next president, and several presidents later, James Monroe, preferred to make arrangements favorable to the Cherokees, as the president is anxious to hold out every inducement to the Cherokees and the other southern nations of Indians to immigrate to the west of the Mississippi. Thus, the Osage were punished for warfare with the Cherokee, culminating in another land cession treaty in 1818 that was deliberately misleading, not negotiated with the necessary leaders, and its promises never fulfilled. By 1825, thousands of American settlers squatted on Osage lands, and as had been the tradition for decades, Osage leaders were forced to accept whatever payment U.S. officials offered before they lost the land completely. The result was expulsion to Kansas, and the Osage presence in their eastern homeland was effectively eliminated. And of course, that's how settler colonialism functions in the United States. All right, so in 1825, the Osage are expelled to present-day Kansas. Okay, so this is a removal. This is ethnic cleansing. So with that always comes massive struggle. Okay, so there are spiritual implications of leaving your homeland, spiritual responsibilities you cannot maintain. That is a spiritual trauma. And the Osage life in Kansas was very difficult. Okay, so they had lived in what we call central or western Missouri on purpose. Okay, this was a place they had chosen because it was effective for their life, for their farming. And now that they're confined to what we call Kansas, where do you live? Where do you farm? Where do you build your towns? And their towns are big, like up to 1,000 residents. So the area of Kansas they're confined to was not nearly as agriculturally productive as where they had lived. So the place where they're confined is what we would now call Southeast Kansas. It was a place, even at the time, plagued with drought, flood, and they had numerous grasshopper plagues that they had to deal with in their time there. It took them 5 years to find and build permanent towns because it was so hard to figure out where the fertile land was because there wasn't very much fertile land. And so that was difficult. All right, disease. Okay, so some of my scholarship in both the book and in some of the other pieces that I've written deals with disease. And disease had to do with disruption. Okay, so there's this myth that when Europeans showed up that they brought these virgin soil diseases and indigenous death went on all across the continent and that it was an accident and European colonizers did not mean for it to happen. And so, it's sort of no one's fault. But in reality, the way disease actually functioned in North America, South America, the Caribbean, and in indigenous people's lives is that it takes colonial disruption for epidemic disease to spread, okay? So you have to have colonial disruption, and if colonial disruption is sustained, that's when you have mass epidemic death. So the Osage do not start having sustained epidemic disease until the 1820s, and that's what we would expect because they were populous and powerful before that. They had had lots of contact with Europeans, intermarriage by that point, but it's not till the 1820s that disruption is extremely severe. All right, and disease doesn't always proportionally kill. So it depending on which disease we're talking about, it can harm women, especially pregnant women, especially children, especially, and that's going to impact the gender balance and fertility long term. Okay, so in Kansas, farming is hard. Okay, so in a lot of cases, their farming was not successful. In fact, it seems that often they're planting as part of their rituals, as part of their spiritual maintenance, their gender maintenance, rather than because it's an effective food source. So they rely more on hunting, trade, and mobility in their Kansas time. But the trouble is just like when the Cherokees and others were refugees in Osage land, the Osage are moving into land also occupied and used by other people. So there's lots of competition over the bison herds, and that makes provision of trade goods and food increasingly difficult. Mobility is a good strategy also to stay away from Americans. Americans bring cholera, for example, to Kansas, and so mobility helps protect the Osage from that. It also protects them from other forces like missionaries, which I'll talk about in a second. But pretty quickly in their time in Kansas, just like their time in Missouri, they face settler invasion. Only the settler invasion in Kansas is even more brutal. All right, so the invasion. The greatest challenge the Osage faced in Kansas came from settler colonialism. As early as March 1853, more than a year before the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, which officially created Kansas Territory, a congressional Indian appropriations bill included an authorization for the president to enter into negotiations with Indian tribes west of the states of Missouri and Iowa for the purpose of securing the assent of said tribes to the settlement of citizens of the United States upon the lands claimed by said Indians, and for the purpose of extinguishing the title of said Indian tribes in whole or in part to said lands. The goal of native elimination could not be clearer. The federal government had just signaled to eager speculators and squatters that native land rights in Kansas were temporary, And if settlers wanted access to the newly available land, they should move now. And they did. By the time Congress debated the Kansas-Nebraska Act a year later, natives faced significant settler invasion. One missionary noted that squatters were not very particular about keeping in the lines, never caring about the limits of the Osage Reservation. From this point on, missionaries and government agents documented settlers coming into the region daily, disregarding reservation boundaries, building homes, tilling fields, destroying food sources, stealing horses, and using violence, including murder, to gain Osage land and resources. Timber resources were often seized, as one federal official commented. In the first place, the Indian and his property is suffering materially by the trespasses of the whites. But the stealing of thousands of dollars worth of timber and carrying to adjoining lands is radically wrong. The Indian is not allowed any privileges on the wild lands of the whites. If found gathering pawpaws, they are driven off like wolves. Beginning in 1853, settlers accelerated the colonization of indigenous people in Kansas, and they were well aware of their role in the settler empire. Quote, "When they came there, they knew they were trespassers, and they had no right whatever to settle where they did. But they were men who wished to fight for their rights. They became very much displeased that the government did not give them each at least a quarter section of this best land for the great hardships that they had endured amongst those savages, and as a reward for their services in driving the Indians from their homes and the graves of their fathers, and occupying their best lands, which they, the settlers, had no shadow of title to." Speeches delivered by so-called leading men and newspaper articles further convinced settlers that Indians have no rights which should be respected by white men. Settlers generally associated in clubs, pledged to defend each other in occupation of claims, created their own militias, organized at least 3 counties entirely inside the Osage Reservation, and then applied to the governor for protection. All the while, Indian agents repeatedly requested the use of military force to guarantee reservation boundaries and remove squatters. But the neglect of the federal government to assert the supremacy of law over a few border men, professional squatters, was regarded as tacit approval of criminal acts by men professing to be just and honest. Hence, more settlers perpetrated the same crime, claiming the right to do what was allowed by others. But why would the federal government bother enforcing temporary land rights? Congress had already made it clear that natives in Kansas would be eliminated, and if settlers were willing to do the work, why not let them? All of this exhibited the systemic nature of U.S. imperialism. In other words, invasion is a structure, not an event, and therefore elimination is an organizing principle of settler colonial society, rather than a one-off occurrence. So the Sellard Invasion was terrible, and it was an especially profound assault on Osage gendered work. So settlers stole women's crops. So as you know, there were many years where they had no successful crops in Kansas. So the fact that they had successful crops and then they were stolen by settlers was particularly egregious. They would steal dried crops that were stored. They'd steal them straight from the fields, or they'd let their livestock graze in Osage women's fields. They would grave rob. So Osage people were buried with various items, including food, for their voyage to the afterlife. And women did most of the burials during the Kansas period, it seems. And so this also was an assault on women's work, but it was an assault on the living and the dead. They also dismantled Osage homes. So the Osage had pretty substantial structures with boards and matted and woven roofs. And those were dismantled and stolen, or sometimes moved right into by settler families. And then they stole horses. By the time we're into the 1860s and 70s, they were stealing 5 to 20 head a day from the Osage herds. And so this also shows you how it assaults men's work, because men were not able to protect their communities and their families from this violence. And the Osage also experienced missionization. They experienced it by Protestants in the period of removal from Missouri, and they experienced by Catholics in Kansas. Though they were hospitable and nice to missionaries, they were very resistant to changing their religion. And actually, some of the missionaries even lament that the Osage are more devout spiritually in their own practices than many of the American settlers around them. And so Willard Rawlings, who's a famous scholar of the Osage calls the Osage unaffected by the gospel. But it shows you who has the power, right? The United States is sending these missionaries to do this work, and that's showing the deteriorating power of the United States. And then, of course, with settler invasion comes sustained land loss from 1863 to 1872. And of course, you can tell this is at the same time as the Civil War. So the Civil War was also extremely disruptive to indigenous and Osage life in Kansas. And we'll see that here. In the chaos caused by the Civil War, federal and state officials saw an opportunity to try to force the Osage to relinquish their Kansas reservation and move to Indian Territory. Again, settler invasions had devastated the Osage, and every level of government had cooperated to dispossess them. Hence, they had little choice but to consent in 1863 to ceding the eastern portion of the Kansas reservation and moving their towns farther west onto what was known as the diminished reservation. However, the treaty languished in Congress, and in 1865, the Osage had to consent to another version, finally ratified in 1866, with funding for removal approved in 1867. After the initial negotiations in 1863, settlers started to flood into the newly ceded land. In 1866, Pawhuska complained to federal officials that when the Osage returned from their winter hunt, they found whites settled on some of our towns. They cut down our timber and eat our bottom grass, which we need for our ponies. As the Indian agent George Snow witnessed, it has not been 2 years yet since Indians relinquished near 2 million acres of their lands to the white settler. Still, they are not satisfied. Immigration rolls on like the tornado, which means nothing to check it. They have overrun all the trust lands and are now settling even on the diminished reservation. In 1867, Agent Snow visited these nearly 70 families and ordered them to leave, but they said they would not remove until he had sufficient arms to force them. They say that laws always have been made to protect the squatter, and they think they will not be left out in the cold when the governor of the state is determined to protect them at all hazards. Hostilities reached such proportions that 4 companies of militia were organized on the border by the state authority, threatening the Indians with, and I quote, extermination. By 1869, 500 families made illegal claims on the diminished reservation. These squatters built houses, began farming, stole Osage crops, allowed their livestock to graze in Osage fields, and prevented Osage women from gathering timber on their claims. To make matters worse, in the fall of 1867, the Osage were attacked by the Arapaho while out buffalo hunting, preventing the acquisition of meat and hides. They were so destitute that federal officials provided rations in February 1868 to combat starvation. Then in May 1868, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs personally met with the Osage, so he comes all the way to meet with them, demanding they leave Kansas, which Osage leaders refused. Hence, he threatened to end rations, to allow angry settlers who were in attendance at the negotiations to exact violent revenge, and finally with outright extermination. As a result, the Osage agreed to transfer their Kansas reservation land directly to a railroad company, which was illegal. Heated debates eventually erupted in Congress over the treaty's questionable legality, preventing ratification. Finally, in July 1870, Congress added provisions to an Indian appropriation bill to buy the Osage land and provide for their confinement in Indian Territory. The new reservations, situated inside Cherokee lands, required an additional 3 years of negotiations to secure Osage title. In the spring of 1872, the majority of the Osage left Kansas for their final reservation in Indian Territory. These repeat removals, excisions from reservations, grants of the same land to different tribes, all conducted against a background of endless pressure for new or revised treaties, were the hallmarks of an Indian policy relentlessly working toward extinguishment of native title. In terms of the Osage in Kansas, unfortunately, the mission was accomplished. So if you look at this map, you can see this shows you what land the Osage lost in each of the treaties we've been talking about. So you see the one that says Treaty of 1865, that's what they ceded in 63, and then the one that says sold in 1870, that was the diminished reservation. And then the Osage Reservation, they're purchased in what we now call Oklahoma in 1870. So I mentioned before that ethnic cleansing also leads to death. 1 in 4 Osage, it's believed, died when they moved to their reservation in Oklahoma, and that's common. They also had mass death when they moved to the Kansas reservation. So if you look at those numbers there, right, so 1825 was removal from Missouri, so you have 10 to 12,000 population. 1850 down to 8,000. 1850 I call the deadliest decade in terms of disease. And that's the decade of settler invasion in Kansas. Then by 1860, we're down to 3,500, 1870, 3,000. So that's an extreme death rate, right? Certainly one could argue a genocidal death rate. So what does this all mean? All right, what does this get us to? What does this tell us? Their time in Kansas was important because the Osage effectively used their religious and economic structure built on gender complementarity to control and direct change. With all of their struggles in Kansas, this should have been the period when the Osage people became culturally or literally extinct. As Patrick Wolfe has argued, settler colonialism destroys to replace. The United States needed the elimination of the natives in order to establish itself on their territory. The pressure just to survive was intended to make the Osage and all indigenous people acquiesce to demands by federal agents and missionaries to change everything. Osage women should have been subjugated as men became farmers and everyone adopted Christianity, or the destruction and despair of it all should have killed them. But that did not happen. Maintaining gendered work and the corresponding religious practices in still relevant ways preserved their social structure that had long used self-directed adaptations to persist and even thrive in a changing world. In Kansas, they made some changes to their economic and ritual practices in light of new circumstances. However, many of the old ways, though severely challenged, were the best methods of survival. In Oklahoma, things were different, and that was where they made more significant changes. Nevertheless, the longevity and solidarity the Osage Nation has today would never have happened if they had become assimilated, sedentary Christian farmers in Kansas. And that is why aspects of gender complementarity still connect the modern Osage with their imperial ancestors. And this last slide I want to show you, this is a screenshot from the Osage Nation's government website today. And I just wanted to point out that the Osage Nation is still exercising their sovereignty, operating in culturally and politically relevant ways. And I don't point this out to minimize the brutality of colonialism, right? The resilience of Osage people is in spite of that colonialism. And this is just evidence of that. So thank you. I look forward to taking your questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for that fantastic presentation. First and foremost, where can we pick up a copy of your book?
What a great question. The University Press of Kansas. I believe their website is kansaspress.ku.edu. So, I'm told you can also buy it on Amazon. Of course, your local bookstore could probably also get that for you.
All right. So, from Kristen Epps, thank you for this informative presentation. Could you talk a little bit about the different kinds of primary sources you used and what your research process looked like?
Oh, well, long, right? So I used all kinds of different sources, right? So you can go to the Osage Museum. So the Osage have a long history of documenting their own history. So we have the Osage Museum. There's also, of course, a lot of those sources that I mentioned that are published sources by Osage tribal members. So they span everything from tribal histories to histories of Alanchka, their social dance and cultural preservation dance that they still practice today. All kinds of government documents, all kinds of missionary records, all kinds of settler records from the Kansas Historical Society. So sort of that wide branch. Archaeology, I looked at some archaeological research. So a lot of sort of in different places, Jesuit archives in Missouri, those kinds of, records. Lots of microfilm, right, that's handwritten, a lot of that.
Awesome. It's always nice to get an insight into the research that really goes into works like this.
I would say a tip to anyone out there, take all your notes on your computer so you can word search and find what you're looking for later. It's key.
Great tip. All right, some more words of praise from Evelyn Davis. That was a fantastic presentation, especially good information about the intention of the Jefferson presidency.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like Andrew Jackson is normally who comes to mind.
Yep, he was just picking up the baton, if you will.
All right, another question. Horrific genocide of Osage, repeated among nations as well. So what, when, and how will the US government apologize at the minimum and give reparations at the maximum?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. Welcome to the question many Indigenous people are asking publicly and privately. So if you're on social media, you may be seeing some of the land back movement. So that's talking about how can land be returned to Indigenous people in a variety of ways. I think it's a long wait for the US government to apologize. And I would argue that's because the US government rarely leads, right? So the US government usually follows what the public is, demanding that they do, right? So we as citizens. have to get to the point where we are demanding that we as a society, as a government, and as communities take actions to repair and support Indigenous people in what they view as decolonizing. So I think, at least in my work with my students, we're a long way from people understanding colonialism and its long history in the United States. And I would say just watching what's been going on in Afghanistan the last few weeks and seeing so little discussion of US colonialism and its long history connected to that shows me that we really aren't thinking about the United States and its engagement with Indigenous people or even people around the world in colonial terms. So I think the better educated we can all get about colonialism, the easier it'll be to talk about these things. But if you want to look at other examples like Canada has done a lot of work, right? Government work on investigating residential schools, right? How do we, reconcile this? And even in that case, it's easier to write the report than it is to take the actions that are demanded of that. Right. But I would say we all live in the empire, right? We're all in colonial relationships with one another, whether we consent to them or not. And we all can heal from doing this work. So you can do it in your own community. You don't have to wait for the federal government because that might be a long wait. So if you're looking for closer to home ways, if you just want one example. So in Wichita, there was a family that inherited, so a relative died and the adult children inherited a piece of land that they know was part of the Kansa land. And so there was a financial gift given to the Kansa Heritage Society as a reparation for the long-term use of their family of Kansa land. So that's just one example. But there are many things you can do on a spectrum, that can be in service to that work.
Thank you. Rosemary asked, what caused your interest in this?
Well, it depends on how far back we want to go. My bachelor's degree is in business, and I minored in history in my undergraduate degree. And I took a class that was about the Plains Indians, which I thought, oh, this will be neat, right? I'll learn some things that I didn't learn before. And the class was taught by Reedy Napier, who ended up later being a mentor of mine. And all of the graduate students in that class that were working with her were all Indigenous. And every day my mouth was hanging open in the class because I was shocked to learn that things that I thought were over, colonization, marginalization, exploitation, murder of Indigenous women and children, were things that are in fact not over. And so after that degree, I was like, I am appalled that I am living in an empire and I don't know it. And I'm now concerned that I'm an agent of colonialism and I don't know it. But specifically this project, I wanted to do something Kansas connected. And there's a really great book, which I have right here, called The Native Ground by Kathleen Duvall. And I highly recommend this book. It's about the Arkansas Valley. It's about the Osage Empire's dominance and the other Indigenous people that live with them. But in one little line in this book, I was reading it, you know how you're eating a book up and you're like, it's the best book I've ever read. She has this one throwaway line where she says that the Osage Empire was built by men and women's place in society probably became less central than in the past. And I was like, how can that be? Why do we think that? That's an assumption, right? That's one of those colonial biases. that indigenous men would abandon indigenous women, but their culture would not have allowed them to be successful without women. And so that's what got me into this specific project.
All right. A question that I had when I was reading your book, and you touched a little bit upon it here, in those cultural spheres, the overlapping region, the men who were instructed by the moon, or men who became as women, like that two-spirit lifestyle. How prevalent was that in Osage culture?
Right. So if we want like actual numbers, right, data is rough. We know there are people because we have stories from Osage elders in the 19th century who talk about them, and then these actual people who you're referencing, Trey. So I think the argument is this is never an overwhelming portion of the population, it seems. But there was space, like that example you're talking about, that man was an adult when he made that transition, right? He had lived successfully in his life for a long period, and he was instructed spiritually, and he was somewhat resistant to it, but he ended up taking on that role. And he's a great example because I think the one you're talking about, he lives life as a woman, but when it's time for war, he dresses as a man and engages in warfare, right? So it's not even a full, like, stereotype gender switch. He exists in this in-between space. But he had to do it from his own mind, and because he was spiritually instructed to do it. So the way we say it in the scholarship is that you don't have to have a lot of people who exist on that spectrum for them to still be important members of the community, right? There aren't a lot of priests, there aren't a lot of chiefs, but they still are important members of the community. And it was just a space where people were allowed and accepted to exist, but also in some cases have a lot of spiritual power. So there are some indigenous communities where indigenous people who lived in the middle two-spirit space, ceremonies could not be conducted unless they were playing a central role in them. So again, it's different in different indigenous communities, but you don't have the strict gender paradigm that most of my students associate with being an American, or being an American in the 19th century especially.
All right, let's see. This is a very fun one. What is something regarding this topic that you don't get the opportunity to talk enough about?
Salt. So
all right.
Yeah, so I don't even think I put it in the book, but I don't even think I mentioned it once, but I have a whole list of notes. When Kristen was asking how I take my notes, right? I have these topic notes that sometimes I make that I don't end up using. But the Osage women would use salt from the salt flats in what we now call Oklahoma. And they would use it for curing meat and other things. And they used it so much. And like, little giveaway, I'm from Hutchinson, Kansas, which has salt mines, and I was a salt hawk in high school. And so just all the discussion about salt, I never wrote anything about it yet. I have thought about writing a piece for my favorite journal, Kansas History, perhaps.
Ooh,
also a publication of the Kansas Historical Society and Kansas State University. But yeah, salt. So there's a lot of interesting things. Again, we don't think of indigenous people as mining. Sac and Fox women mined lead. Anasazi and Pueblo ancestors mined turquoise. And the Osage didn't have to mine it because it was in salt flats. But I got a lot of notes on it, but I've not done much with it.
When I was reading, I was actually totally thinking about salt, and especially with food preservation. That came to mind. So
yeah, and it seemed like it was women's work. So that's what I didn't get it in there.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Looks like we got one more question that came rolling in from Diana.
Sure.
Again, thanking you for this presentation. How organized or structured was the Osage Empire? Did it function as a single unit, or was it more of a collection of independent towns and groups?
Yes, so it's more of the latter. So it's more decentralized. So these are people that culturally identify with one another. Absolutely. But you think of leadership at the town level, and every Osage town, and remember, their towns were big, so they could be up to 1,000 people. So every Osage town had a full complement of the Osage clan structure so that they can conduct all ceremonies on a town basis. And then I think it would be fair to say that there were then groupings of towns, right? Regions of sort of close proximity towns. So that's why we say the Little Osage were sort of north, the Great Osage were in the sort of historic central Osage homeland. And then the Arkansas Osage moved to the south to sort of follow their economic opportunities that are in the South, much, by the way, to the chagrin of the Caddoan people who live there, who were like, hello, we live here. Please don't come and take access to our resources and marginalize us. But the Arkansas Osage then moved down there. And so as time goes on, the treaties often had to be renegotiated with the Arkansas because the Arkansas would refuse to abide by them. So like when we came to removal to Kansas, the Arkansas Osage refused to go. And so a separate treaty had to be negotiated with them. And at the time that they were forced to go to Kansas, smallpox breaks out amongst them, and then they have extra death at the time. So I think, so to answer your question in sum, it's decentralized, but I actually would argue that's strategically successful. So you could argue that the Osage Empire is structured to be decentralized, and that's economically and spiritually effective. But it's the United States that operates as a very top-down, right, sort of empire, and they try to force the Osage to operate in that same way, right? If we negotiate something with one of you, we're holding all of the people in your nation to it, which is a convenient colonizer method.
All right, we'll finish this out with 2 more sections of praise for you. One from Marla. Brilliant research and riveting presentation, Dr. Edwards, bravo.
Thank you.
And from Patricia, thanks to you both for your scholarship and generosity to help us understand our history. Just fantastic. Makes you feel all warm and fuzzy.
Yes.
A very, very serious topic. Well, again, I can't recommend it enough. Gotta go out, get a copy. You will be impressed by all of the insights that Dr. Edwards has.
Yep. Thank you so much. And I appreciate being with you, and it's been a wonderful time. So let me know. Yep. And feel free to reach out to me if you have more questions.
Perfect. I will do so. So I hope everyone will join us again next month, Friday, October 8th at 6:30 to hear Dr. Brent Campney present on his book, This Is Not Dixie, Racist Violence in Kansas, 1861 to 1927. Campney's broad consideration of racist violence lends new insights into the ways people resisted threats and helps to rewrite fundamental narratives on mob action, race relations, African-American resistance, and racism's grim past in the heartland. You won't want to miss this program. It's really going to be something.
And I've seen Brent present, and he's really wonderful, and that's also a great book. So I encourage everybody to join.
All right. Well, hopefully you'll be in attendance then.
Sounds good.
I'll hold you to it.
Okay.
Well, from all of us here at Museum After Hours, thank you so much and good night.